The British motor industry has an incredible track record in producing interesting and technically brilliant cars, allied to diabolical decision making. We've already seen more than enough of them on Twin Cam, but today we have what may be the jackpot. Among the biggest white elephants ever produced by the United Kingdom, the Austin 3 litre. Before we begin, Twin Cam is proudly supported by Bidding Classics, the new online classic car marketplace with an array of cool and interesting old cars on offer. So if you fancy getting yourself another classic, or maybe your first classic, then please do follow the link in the description. Just under a year ago, you and I were fortunate enough to study the Land Crab, BMC's radical and incredible mid-size saloon that launched in 1964, the big brother of the legendary Mini and wildly successful 1100 and 1300. If you fancy catching up on that one before the rest of this, then I'll put a card up in the corner. But the short version is that these three cars characterised a revolution for BMC, or the British Motor Corporation, who 12 years prior became the result of a rather messy merger between two of Britain's motoring giants, Austin and Morris. The two manufacturers brought with them an array of confusing marques and models, but very slowly they were shaking off their previously conservative image and embracing ultra-modern engineering principles. Our three new family cars were the children of a genius designer, Alec Izagonis, and were blessed with front-wheel drive, whereby their engines were mounted transversely and had their gearboxes in the sump, leading to a marvel of packaging and miniaturisation. For exceptional handling, they had rack and pinion steering, and best of all, hydrolastic suspension. With rubber springs and interconnected fluid damping, these three were some of the best driving family cars the world had ever seen. And the Land Crab took things a step further by having a monocoque body shell so strong it negated the need for subframes. But there was a storm brewing. Even if we ignore the internal politics, industrial relations and suspect build quality, you may have noticed that I referred to the Mini and 1100 as legendary and wildly successful. But our friend the Land Crab wasn't quite on the same page. Stingy furnishings and awkward styling left it languishing in the wake of the Ford Cortina. But if you think it failed, then you ain't seen nothing yet. We'll get to just how bad it ended up being later on, but for now we need some of that traditional Twin Cam historical context. You see, back in the mid-1960s, the executive car market was much less aspirational than it is today. The 3 litre class was filled with the kind of cars that were bought by grey and unremarkable men, business people and company directors, the kind of people that suited a black and white world. Before the Austin 3 litre, BMC had the Austin Westminster, very fitting name, and alongside it were its posh, badge-engineered cousins, the Wolseley 699 and Van den Plas 3 litre. Alternatively, you could have a Vauxhall Cresta or the posh Vauxhall Viscount, and with a blue oval on the front, a Ford Zodiac or Swish Ford Executive. They may be classic, elegant and even look rather rakish today, but in 1966 or so, these were all middle-of-the-road cars for those with a portfolio. They may have been traditional, but they were a very important part of the market, because as we all know, expensive cars have bigger profit margins, so BMC had to be right at the centre of it, even if it was a very different image to the one being given off by the Mini Cooper, for example. As you'd expect, the new 3 litre was to shun all the Izagonis front drive stuff. Not only was it a bit radical, but it was also unnecessary, because as they found out with the Land Crab, in a car of that scale, packaging was rather far down the agenda. This was to be a traditional motor car, and on the surface that sounds sensible enough, but here's where the BMC lunacy comes in. The British motor industry has never had an excellent relationship with accountants. After decades of just getting by and spaffing it up the wall with CV joints and clever gearboxes, they had to rein in the spending, and it was about to spill over into something the buying public couldn't ignore. The new 3-litre would have to share its centre section with the smaller Land Crab, and that means the glasshouse, doors, passenger space and general proportions were all preset. So let's first discuss the styling. It's not great, is it? The first problem is the thing we've already mentioned, the doors. The fact they were the same as the Land Crab meant a lot of people thought these two were the same car, but they aren't. Well, in terms of the Land Crab, that didn't really make a massive difference. The 3-litre was made to look cheaper by association. And that's really not a good start when you're trying to build an expensive car. But as your eyes will have shown you, we're not finished yet. I like the Land Crab, but I understand that the prevailing view is that it's ugly. But the worst crime an ugly car can commit is to be bland. Everyone remembers cars like the Fiat Multipla because they're interesting to look at. I think the Land Crab gets away with it for 3 reasons. It's stubby, it's goofy, and it's an engineering thoroughbred. But the Land Lobster is just a slab of ill thought out car. It is at least the right length for the door, so it looks fine from the side, even rather stately. Not bad at all. But that face is effectively enlarged from that on the Land Crab, and with that extra size, it's not smiley anymore. It's pained. It's sinister in a weird sense. The quad headlamps are actually an improvement, because initially the car had square eyes, which were even more bland. And they were swapped at the very last minute before sales started, as even BMC knew they'd cocked up. And at the back, they clearly couldn't make up their mind. Should it have fins or shouldn't it? And in the end, they kind of went half and half. Overall, it's a car that looked too similar to its poorly received little brother. It looked outdated from day one, and it wasn't as imposing as the old Westminster. BMC and later British Leyland do have a mixed reputation when it comes to styling, but the Farina saloons, one of which was the Westminster, were good-looking cars. The Mini was cute and cuddly, the 1100 was sharp and classy, and the Land Crab was kind of adorable. But they were all strong statements, and this just isn't that. And in the 1960s, a decade so beholden to style, this isn't good enough. But you may be thinking, in a market so conservative and one that was beginning to die, as we'll get to, surely this was BMC simply saving as much money as possible. So beneath this body, it must have shared all its components. Under the bonnet, you'd be forgiven for thinking so, because this is a proper tank of an engine, the C-Series straight 6. We've already seen cars with A-Series and B-Series engines before on Twin Cam, and this is the biggest of the BMC bunch, with the correct number of cylinders. But unlike the other two, this one came from Morris. But despite that, it's all still very traditional in terms of concept. Cast iron, overhead valve, non-crossflow. But unlike the Tiddlers, it does have 12 ports, so that's something. However, taken from this view, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is the same engine that was used in the old Westminster. But it isn't. You see, the C-Series dates from 1954 and was designed to replace Morris's pre-BMC range of overhead cam engines that were powerful and modern, but were rather unreliable. As a result, the prevailing philosophies were ease of manufacture and solidity. That's why they took a seemingly retrograde step in fitting push rods, and for easy production, the crankshaft down the bottom was only fitted with 4 main bearings. That was okay in the 50s, but fast forward to the mid-1960s, and this engine was being used in sports cars like the Austin Healey 3000, and it was slated to go into the MGC. The problem was that 4 main bearings didn't provide the ability to rev or the strength for greater power output. And with the new MG and the 3-litre on the way, the engine was totally redesigned. First up were 7 main bearings, but above them, the cylinders were all moved around to improve cooling, and a new, freer flowing cylinder head was fitted. They even used aluminium here and there, resulting in an engine that was physically smaller, 20 kilograms lighter, and was essentially brand new. Great for engineering, but in a car whose public face was one of cost cutting, it sounds a little bit unnecessary. In our Austin 3 litre it was detuned a fair bit, and with twin SU carburettors produces 125 brake horsepower from its 2912cc, which means it's not actually a 3 litre, it's a 2.9. This story's already proving itself to be really convoluted in a truly British Leyland kind of way. But despite all those engine mods, the C-Series is still not the best engine, if I'm honest. This car might have 123 horsepower, but it doesn't feel like it. The engine is really lethargic, and though right at takeoff it does take up quite quickly, then you get to 15 miles per hour and it kind of stops. It is very smooth, but it's got next to no character to it, and that's such a shame from a big 6-cylinder engine which has the potential to be fantastic. The gearbox, however, I am quite impressed by. It's an automatic and I believe it's 3-speed. Might be wrong there, as BMC usually had 4-speed gearboxes, but I think this is a 3-speed box and it's buttery smooth. It changes just when you want it to, and it just takes off so effortlessly. There's no kind of delay in anything it does. It feels much more modern than it actually is. That's not to say it's electric, but you know, it just goes about its business. And I think in a way actually, the engine and gearbox do match up quite well together, because although the engine isn't really up to much, it's fine in a car this traditional. It's only if you were looking at something genuinely sporting like a Jaguar XJ6 or a Rover P6, something like that, something with a bit more to it, you might be disappointed. But for just wafting about very effortlessly, this is all right. It does everything just well. It's fine, it's adequate. What I will say is that sitting here behind this steering wheel in this car with the power steering, it feels so regal. I feel like a king driving this thing with the red seats, this big bonnet out in front of me, the little mirrors on the wings, and I can just see the little Austin badge glinting down at the front. This is so enjoyable. But all we've found out so far is that the 3 litre is a curiosity in the theme of Austins from the 60s. After all, the Mini 1100 and Land Crab we met before were all engineering thoroughbreds. In comparison, the existing Austin Westminster was from another planet. It was totally traditional with leaf springs and live axles. But if you think the 3 litre was to continue that lineage, then you'd be well off the mark. A front-wheel drive layout was rejected because packaging just wasn't an issue. But on the suspension side, the 3 litre would make use of what I believe to be one of history's greatest suspension systems: Hydrolastic. Taking its influence from Citroen's Hydropneumatics, Hydrolastic shuns traditional springs in favour of 4 displacers, featuring rubber springs and pressurised with a fluid linked through pipes front to back on each side, but independently side to side. And it's designed to combine brilliant, floaty comfort with surprising resistance to roll and incredible handling as well. And in a big car like the 3 litre, those characteristics are exactly what you want. You don't want a car that rides firmly. This is a huge barge of a car. And interestingly, this is the only hydrolastic or hydrogas sprung car to have a traditional mechanical layout. The MGF was rear-wheel drive as well, but that was mid-engine, transverse mounted. This is a proper longitudinal front-engine rear-drive car, and it's the only one to be fitted with Hydrolastic. Some of you may remember back to the Land Crab video when I was just utterly besotted by the way it drove. That car had a better engine than this, I will admit, even though it only has 4 cylinders. It's much more alive than the C-Series that's sleepy. It's, you know, the kind of car that you want to just waft effortlessly in. You don't want to put any pressure on a C-Series engine car, you want to take it smoothly. But I was so besotted by the Land Crab, more down to its suspension. But this goes about it in a very different kind of way. There you go, we got a few revs out of it there, but it's not happy to do it. It would rather sit down low, 2,000–3,000 RPM. That's all it wants. Doesn't want any more. But the Land Crab has a wheel right at each corner of the car, and so it's agile. It drives like a Mini in many ways, and you wouldn't expect a car of that size to be able to drive in a manner that's so nimble, but it can. This is not like that. This is so much more wafty than the Land Crab, and you feel the need to kind of direct it with the steering rather than grab it with the steering, if you get what I mean. The earlier Hydrolastic cars were fantastic. There's no doubt about it. But if there had to be a criticism, it's that they had a tendency to bounce. It was gentle, not uncomfortable, but over certain terrains, Minis and 1100s especially, had a bounciness. With some fine tuning, the rear units were modified to totally solve this issue, but the 3-litre would go a lot further than that. This was an executive luxury car, so BMC gave it self-levelling. With an engine-driven hydraulic pump, rams at the back raised and lowered the suspension based on the load, something we're still wowed by today, giving the Austin 3-litre, if I hadn't already built it up enough, one of the best ride qualities in the world. But in a Land Crab you don't need that level of agility because first of all, it's huge, it's absolutely massive, and second of all, it weighs 1,500 kilos, which in this era was a lot. So it's fine just wallowing about the place in supreme comfort. Like, I've never experienced a car quite as comfortable as this. It's phenomenal and mind-blowing how in 1967 the world could build cars this comfortable. And yet today we build cars that are really harsh and with the roads worse than ever. Why you'd want anything but an Austin 3-litre, I don't quite know. It's so beautifully wafty. What a car. But although it isn't as direct as the Land Crab, you can still throw it about. It's still got pretty good suspension to start with, so you don't feel as though you need to be careful around this car. You can still go and chuck it into corners when you want to, and it will sort itself out. There is a huge pothole there going underneath your side of the car, and could you feel it? I didn't think so. Hydrolastic suspension gets a bit of a bad name. And it only gets a bad name because people are idiots and people don't really know how the system works and how it needs to be cared for. But when you do understand the engineering behind it and you understand how actually it's cheaper to run than a traditional coil and telescopic shock absorber setup, I don't see the downside. You just need to learn how the system works and then you can appreciate how brilliant it is, because this car and the Land Crab and the Hydrolastic Mini even, they all ride so well, so incredibly well. Just this morning I drove a Jaguar XJ8, an X308 generation from around the turn of the century. And you lot won't have seen that yet. That'll be coming either next week or in a few weeks. But that's a Jag. And Jags are meant to be the ultimate in compromise between ride and handling, but it has nothing on this. The steering, despite it being power assisted and having this huge, huge rim, is really communicative. You can feel what it's doing. It's delicate. I'm just a tiny movement to taking me across the road. And that car can't touch this in terms of ride quality. It's just, the engine isn't up to much and the styling and image is all so off, but I cannot express enough how brilliantly this car drives. Hydrolastic suspension, my friends. It's the future, I'm telling you. It is the future. I could so happily sit and waft about in this car all day. So we have a predicament. In front of us is a car that looks quite old-fashioned. It has an engine that, while trusty, isn't flushed with character. However, this is one of the finest driving big cars you could buy, and it's remarkable how a car so uninspiring and distinctly average on one side of the page, you can flip it over and it's a world beater. However, I can absolutely understand why none of this was a recipe for success, and yet again, the thing I think throws it over the cliff is its little brother. From the side, we're reintroduced to these doors, and we've already gone over how that means that the 3 litres passenger compartment is about the same size as that of the Land Crab. But unlike the Land Crab, this car's rear-wheel drive. Alec Izagonis had nothing to do with it, and that means all of his packaging genius goes straight down the drain. If you got this far, you'll probably know that this is a transmission tunnel, and it's huge. And despite the fact the Land Crab was an incredibly practical car, it takes a big scoop out of the centre of its practicality. Although the 3 litre is a little bit wider than the Land Crab, it's not that much wider, which means that you're paying more money for a bigger car with less space. Madness, I know. For reference, this is the interior of the Land Crab, a top-of-the-range Wolseley, I'll have you know. But notice the space. It's like a TARDIS in here. You feel as though you have to shout at your passengers. Yet in the 3 litre, a space that's wider feels smaller thanks to the big spine running through it. If we took the 3 litre on its lonesome, this wouldn't be an issue, and compared to its contemporaries, it's more than acceptable. But the Land Crab was so good that it overshadowed a car worth nearly half as much again. Still, it's a lovely looking interior. This is traditional done right with wood and not leather. This material was specially designed for the 3 litre, but it looks and feels just as good, especially in red. This is a proper feast. We even have a strip speedometer for peak 60s futurism. I love it. Plus, despite the deficiencies, it fixes a few of the Land Crab's flaws. You see, because the 3 litre is longer, the pedals can be further away, removing the famous upright driving position. And with the steering rack further away, the steering wheel is at a normal angle. All this car seems to be is more and more give and take, but everything is relating back to a car that it didn't compete with or replace. But as I alluded to earlier, this market segment was dying. First, let's fast forward to the 2010s, and the large family car market was changing. Cars like the Ford Mondeo and Vauxhall Insignia were being usurped by the BMW 3 Series and Mercedes C-Class. The latter two may be smaller, but they were considered better to drive, better to look at, and most importantly, endlessly more desirable. And rewind to 1967 when the 3 litre was launched, and the same thing was happening. Add Austin to Ford and Vauxhall, and smaller competition from the likes of Rover and Jaguar were wiping out the old guard. So let's turn to the price sheets, and let's set a baseline. At its demise, an Austin Westminster was £1,231. Meanwhile, up at the top of the market was another BMC car we haven't even mentioned here, the Van Plas 4 litre R. Essentially, this is an upmarket Westminster, but with involvement from Rolls-Royce and a bigger engine, and one of those was £2,030. That gives us some serious wiggle room, but this market was like that. These cars were expensive enough that the average buyer could probably afford an extra few £100s in order to buy what he, and it inevitably was a he, really wanted. Our new Austin 3 litre sits rather low in that collection at £1,577, and its top spec colleagues from Ford and Vauxhall were £1,665 and £1,629 respectively. But let's now go into the real luxury manufacturers, and we'll start with Humber, because despite being the Roots Group's luxury mark, the Super Snipe was still on the same page as the mainstream at £1,587. But turning over to Rover, and Britain's traditional giant in this segment showed its worth, because with its new 3.5 litre V8, a Rover P5B was all the way up at a staggering £2,174. Probably out of reach of our Austin buyer, but compromise is a virtue. And if you were willing to give up some space, you could have a V8 Rover P6 for £1,791. And compromise is just that, because no company had such a progressive image as Jaguar. But the phenomenal new XJ6 was a pound under £2,000. Still beneath our old friend the Van & Plas, but for only £77 more than the Austin, you could have a Jaguar 340, the rebadged Mark II. And with all this in mind, it's not surprising they struggled to sell these ugly ducklings. You could make the argument that these cars were bought by a very conservative end of the market, but chasing a dying market never does anyone any good. Despite some very sound engineering and a bargain price, the 3 litres' total lack of desirability scuppered its chances before anyone had driven one. This car was a calamity. BMC had expected around 10,000 sales a year, but in the end, they built less than 10,000 overall. Early in its development, BMC had envisioned Wolseley and Van & Plas versions of the basic Austin, but predictably, they never came to be. In 1966, the year before this car was even launched, BMC bought Jaguar, and 2 years on, they were swallowed up by Rover's parent company to form the infamous British Leyland. With that internal competition and such an awful reputation, it's no wonder the 3 litre was quietly killed. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with this car. In fact, it's a decent car at a fair price with one of the world's best ride qualities. However, when we consider the image problems and the context of the era, it just didn't have a leg to stand on. The revised C-Series that debuted in this car would die here. Hydrolastic and later Hydrogas, while it would live on to the 21st century, the self-levelling died here as well. And to round it all off, this was the last big Austin. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.